Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Vivid Voltage, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using the code Omnipoke. For today's video, we are going to be going over the best decks in Standard post-Vivid Voltage, really looking at the impact of the brand new set, talking about the most promising new archetypes, as well as looking back at the current favourites of the format and seeing how these decks will be adapting. So first of all, let's have a look and remind ourselves of what the best decks have been pre-Vivid Voltage. ADP-Zacian, even in the Players' Cup 2 right now, was the deck that had the most conversions into the top 256 of each region, and for Oceania it was top 128. That was the most populated deck. Pikachu and Zekrom second most, Eternatus third most in two different variations, mostly a split between the straight list, which is just Eternatus himself, and then like Deci Goons and Scoop Up Nets and a few other attackers like Sableye. And then there's the poison-based list, which is using Galarian Slowbro and Toxicroak to augment your damage output. Those were like massively the top three decks, and Centiskorch was in there as well. Those were definitely the most popular archetypes. LucMetal Zacian was also really popular, so think of the top 5 most popular decks being ADP, PikaRom, Eternatus, Centiskorch variants, both greens and straight lists that was just using Dedenes and Crobats and Eldegoss and that sort of thing, and LucMetal. Those were definitely like the most popular decks of the pre-Vivid Voltage format, and some of the most successful ones as well, as we could see from the results, well, the early results at least, from the Players' Cup 2. Also in there, Baby Blacephalon, it did quite well in Players' Cup also. And then as you move across to the right side of your screen, you can see lists that also did have a bit of a showing in the format and were certainly relevant archetypes to be aware of, but had a lot less popularity than those the ones on the very far left of your screen here. So a ton of different ways to play Mewtwo. Welder Mewtwo, there was the Mewtwo with PikaRom, so Mewtwo being an archetype as well, born out of the Players' Cup, played by Pedro Torres, as well as Tord Reklev and a handful of others, I believe. Kind of a secret deck for that exact tournament. And I believe Pedro's also played some more recent tournaments as well, still doing quite well with that archetype. There's been the water-based build of Mewtwo with Frosmoth, trying to use Blastoise GX's attacks. Inteleon Frosmoth as well, really was born at the start of this format and really fell off a little bit towards the latter stages, but certainly had an early showing. Different builds of Welder as well. Welder Box sort of merging a couple of Heatrans, Reshizard, mostly because of the popularity of ADP and LucMetal as we got further through the season. Basically, people went back to just playing Fire decks because of the popularity of those two main archetypes. Attacking Excadrill also became a bit of a thing late on, thanks to its type coverage against Eternatus mostly, as well as PikaRom, which also had a huge resurgence with Crushing Hammer becoming a staple in the archetype and really being the carry for PikaRom going forward. Decidueye Obstagoon was always in and around. Excadrill Control wasn't really played so much of the Players' Cup, but that was due to the tournament ticket restrictions for the most part, and then it didn't really convert over into the 256 either too well, so it's kind of hurt by the rules of the Players' Cup tournament ticket keys rather than anything else, but certainly a reasonable archetype. There was also Dragapult VMAX, which more often than not was trying to dodge and weave Eternatus / added in Clefable to the list, as well as Energy Disruption to try and deny them from attacking altogether. Mad Party is one of the only surviving one-prize decks in the format alongside Baby Blacephalon, as well as Rillaboom VMAX, which didn't really have much of a foothold, but had some highlight reels in here. Only really wanted to squeeze this deck into the slide here, even though it's quite a questionable one, because I'm hoping that it's going to be one that's adapting for the better going forward, so we'll look at that in a little bit. Now let's talk about the new introductions of Vivid Voltage. For me, so far in my testing, and it's only been a few days where decks have been out on PTCGO, and pre-PTCGO it was basically me battling myself a lot of the time and doing theory crafting. So my testing is still limited. It's still early days for sure, and I have seen Orbeetle VMAX did get a top 8 recently at a 200-player online tournament. I'm not going to completely write off that deck, but from my own testing so far, the decks that I believe could end up being high-tier contenders are going to be Colossal VMAX, as well as a Whimsicott variant, which is trying to spam a bunch of tools and deal decent damage output for one energy attachment. Those are really the two that I think are the big standouts from Vivid Voltage, from what I can tell so far. I do think Orbeetle could be good, and we've seen a list that has at least made top 8 at this big tournament early on. My main concerns with Orbeetle, which we'll get into a little bit more later. I mean, the obvious one is that it's weak to fire, and LucMetal Zacian is going to be more popular, and it's going to get hit in that crossfire, literally, of the amount of fire decks being in the format. I also think there's just other glaring weaknesses like crushing hammers and a few other things here and there. And its damage cap is, fairly low a lot of the time for some attacking decks, especially because Zacian has resistance and stuff like that. So, yeah, I'll get into those weaknesses in a little bit. But I just wanted to say that, yes, it may end up sort of making it over to that high tier contention area, but I do think it will naturally have some weaker matchups, mostly to the Zacian decks, ADP and LucMetal, and I still believe those decks will be like pretty much the two top tier decks of the format on their own, and that's a bad thing for Orbeetle, I would say. Togekiss VMAX is an interesting one. It can cherry pick cards for your hand, and we've seen that previously work in the past. There's been Sylveon sort of stalling variants in the past, and possibly Togekiss could try and relive that sort of vibe where you're trying to get some tanking pieces back into your hand, possibly using things like Porygon Z, Recycle Energy, and Hyper Potions, or possibly trying to use Corviknight if you really want to. Or you're just accumulating hand disruption combos, similar to what we saw with Charizard Breaks Index. Late on in the format, we saw some Greenzard make a bit of headway back in the format, and it was mostly down to the Breakzard accumulating hand disruption combos, which was interesting. There's a new one-prize Charizard Leon deck, which has can be acquired through the theme deck, and seems to be a decent budget option. Donphan Spiritomb, good type coverage, definitely a buff to like the straight Spiritomb lists that we had previously. Cramorant Arrokuda seems more on the memeier side because of the bench management, but it can do some decent damage for a one prize option. Darmanitan Spread, definitely some highlight reel moments can be had with an archetype like this, but it is multiple stage ones. Pikachu VMAX, one of the poster boys of Vivid Voltage. There's Raichu Electrode as well, which is trying to be a green space list, which is trying to use the Electrode to blow itself up to then weave in stamps and be a disruptive option whilst also paralyzing people early on, similar to how we've seen things like Miss Magius and Magneton combos in the past with greens. Clefable Dolls I've already profiled on the channel as well. It's a loop of the prankish Clefable trying to be energy disruptive for the most part, and there's also some murmurings of an Amazing Rare box going around. I'm pretty certain that Amazing Rare box is Mimi from everything that I've tried so far, but we'll talk about it anyway as we do jump into more detail now with these individual decks. Why I think Colossal is going to be pretty strong. His type coverage is very, very good. Pikachu and Zekrom and Eternatus were pre-Vivid Voltage, two of the most popular archetypes, and we're getting some good conversions in most online tournaments. So Colossal coming in, definitely stamping its authority on Pikachu and Zekrom, making life very awkward for them. Now, I do think Eternatus can adapt. Eternatus can obviously try and weave in things like Weak Guard Energy and Piers if need be to even scout that out a little bit earlier, but I still believe it would be a difficult matchup against Colossal because the tanking Colossal has just puts it way out of range of Eternatus, so even if you're trying to two-shot one another, it's like at the very least an even fight, and any time they're whiffing on the Weak Guard Energy, or if you choose to add in, for example, Giratina into your list, where you can just remove that Weak Guard Energy, you're really going to have a good time against those kind of archetypes, so Colossal should be having a very good time against those. At the same time, fighting typing is very good for dealing with the Denes and Crobats in any sort of matchup. So in a ton of different games, you're going to have really easy ways to just gust and take two prizes, even on one attachment turns. So really, you only really need to build to G-Max Boulder like sometimes once in a game. Sometimes you don't even need to build towards it at all, and you can just get through using Eruption Shot over and over. So the tanking potential is great with Stone Fighting Energy. You can even play buff padding if need be. You can also choose to play things like Big Charm, because then you can use Galarian Surfetched V as well in your deck as an option to help you get around Zamazenta. So that could definitely be an option for you. I found Surfetch to be a very decent option. It can give you a really nice midway point where you're not quite ready to G-Max Boulder, but the Surfetch can steal enough energy for himself to still get a bigger hit in than Eruption Shot would, and I found that very useful. The obvious combo for Eruption Shot is trying to use the likes of Primate Wisdom. There's also Amazing Rare Jirachi and Rotom Phone if you want to have additional synergies there to make sure that your top deck is always going to be a fighting energy card. Well, it could be any energy card, but normally you want it to be a fighting. You may want to weave in one or two things like Capture Energies, because you do have a colorless attack cost on GMAX Boulder, but I don't think it's super important. My biggest worries for Colossal VMAX is that it doesn't have great answers. I mean, you can't get through Zamazentas very easily, even with Galarian Surfetch. Sometimes, especially if it's the LucMetal base build and they're going to have Metal Goggles on top of you, the Surfetch is going to be trying to like trade into them, and it's really down to you versus their Malolanas, and things get pretty sketchy, especially because they can simply retreat into Zacian if they want to and get through the Surfetch quite easily unless you've stacked a bunch of Stone Fightings onto it. So I think that's where it gets very sketchy. I'm also obviously worried about Decidueye. If Deci Goons still does survive, and if people begin to stop respecting it because of the new inclusion of Aegislash in the format, Colossal is going to get sort of gobbled up quite easily by any Decidueye base build. So that certainly is a concern. And when you're not hitting for weakness, I do think that damage output is a small issue. I think it can be awkward against ADP at times. There's been builds that I've seen that are trying to ignore the likes of Dedenne, Crobat, and Eldegoss for exactly that reason, because your ADP matchup would be just too sketchy if you have those easy prizes for ADPs to gust and take knockouts on. So instead, trying to go for an approach where you use Snorlax and Orangaroos only. My biggest concern with that is you normally need to develop at least one Orangaroo on board, sometimes multiple, and I think it's hard pressed for you to try and stop them even taking two prize knockouts on the smaller things that you would be playing. So I still feel like ADP will get around this quite a lot, and I think that's a bit of an issue. Just basically leaving Zacians on board for too many turns is just going to give those sorts of decks way too much value. So a little bit concerning there for the most part. I could end up being wrong, and I still think that there's a lot to like about the Colossal. So it's going to be interesting to see whether it goes down a very disruptive based route where it's very slow and trying to be stamp heavy and make big comebacks with GMAX Boulder, or if it's going to try and be relatively early tempo and in a way similar to ADP, where you're trying to take easy gust knockouts for one energy attachment and trying to heal your big man as much as possible. I'm more happy with the latter of those two options, but I think we could see the option for both. Whimsicott Tool Drop is going to be the next option that I think is very solid so far. Everything I've tested with Whimsicott's been A, the most fun, and B, I think actually realistically the most obviously powerful one prize deck that we've seen in a while. I think it's going to be far better than Mad Party has been, and a lot of the reason why is because you have a Psychic Energy attack cost, so you can choose to use Latios GX if you want to have a reasonable answer against ADP. At the same time, you can try and use Heracross. I've seen a few people use that as an alternative to at least pick up the ADP after they've GX'd. It gives you a little bit more leeway to actually get the attack off, whereas Latios, you put yourself on a short clock. But normally I think with the quick balls that you have, the great balls, and sometimes even communication on top of that, it's not really that difficult to fill your board with Latios and actually get it attacking, especially because you have so many free retreat pivots for whatever you started with, because you naturally play a high U-turn board count and a high air balloon count. You should get Latios working. So in general, I think this is like one of the only one prize decks alongside Baby Blounds now that can still compete with ADP even if they hit their GX attack. So I think that's one of the biggest boasting options that Whimsicott has available to it. And also I think its damage output is just really good. Flying Fury gets to 250 if you're binning 6 tools all at once. And, that's one-shotting PikaRom, big card in the format. You're doing easy 2-shots on VMAXs. Even if they're using Malolanas, you can still 2-shot them by getting another load of 6 all thrown into the discard pile the following turn. So U-turn board obviously gives you that recyclable damage as well. That's the most crucial card of the deck for sure, because it goes straight back to your hand, so you're not constantly losing damage the entire time. So yeah, Whimsicott, there's a lot to like. I think it's a relatively simple engine to build. I think Amazing Rare Jirachi is a real star in this deck. I think it's fantastic. I've seen a few other draw-based engines as well. I've quite enjoyed a 2-2 Gradient line. I've also found a 2-2 Cincino to be quite reasonable. I don't think you want to go the full 4-4, and I definitely don't think Garbodor fits in this deck. I feel like you only want to play Horror Psychic Energies and Basic Psychic Energies, and then just have Ordinary Rods to recycle your Whimsicott, possibly playing things like Hooper and some other basic Pokemon that are 1 energy attachments to help finish things off from your Whimsicott. But yeah, I think those are some big bonuses for Whimsicott. My only real question marks are that your early game can sometimes be kind of rushed because it's really based on just how many basic Pokemon you see in those early turns. You obviously want to develop multiple Cottony, you want to develop as many basics as possible, and if you come up against early pressure decks, or if you go second against certain archetypes and they start knocking out things, it's not only that they're initiating a prize race and getting rid of some of your resources, but it's also something that you no longer can put a tool on top of as well, so you can end up using like research on tools that you don't necessarily want to. So it makes your sequencing kind of annoying. That's one of the only flaws I think with Whimsicott, is that its early game can still be a little bit sketchy. And of course, you do insta scoop to the likes of Vikavolt. If you do see a Vikavolt V knocking around, that's going to be very, very awkward for you. Now, is Whimsicott going to be popular enough for PikaRom to try and work in Vikavolt? I'm not too sure. PikaRom has its own problems, right? Because there's already Colossal to be concerned about. But if Whimsicott does get big enough, we do know that there's a one-card answer in PikaRom if need be, and there's a handful of other decks that can use Aurora Energy as well if they want to. So I don't think this is going to be like a tippy top-tier contender, but I do think it's going to sit around that sort of 2.5 category and be one of the more solid one-prize decks. Togekiss VMAX is all about trying to heal up this 310 hit point Pokemon and disrupt your opponent as well with the likes of Reset Stamp and such. Your damage output isn't necessarily impressive. If you do play a Porygon Z build, you can play Recycle Energies as well as powerful Colorless Energies, so you can actually push this into at least two-shotting tag teams as well, which is really important actually. I think if you're not two-shotting tag teams, you're really in danger, and I think this damage output is just too low. So I think Porygon Z makes the most sense for me. So it is going to be awkward when you're getting gusted and things like that, but the whole reason why Porygon sits in play is so that you can heal yourself anyway. So if they are gusting Porygon, he's kind of done his job regardless, and he's still helping you get towards that Reset Stamp number as well. So I think that's been the way that I've enjoyed it most. There's obvious upside for being a colorless Pokemon, similar to how we've seen Salamence take advantage of Capture Energy, powerful colorless energy, and Recycle. Togekiss is trying to do the same thing, really. And get working with that Max Glide. It can obviously help you get the Porygon in the early turns as well. So yeah, I think it's reasonable. It's really, really hoping that Lightning decks are scared away by Colossal and possibly Donphan Spiritomb as well, because otherwise you're just going to get railed by any Lightning decks that are sticking around. So that's the thing. That's your biggest worry. Although you are very good at hand disrupting your opponents, you're also very scared of hand disruption. If you're getting constantly chained by like Marnies and stuff like that, ultimately your stats just aren't that good. It only takes one turn of a Marnie and then you missing like a heal combo or something like that, Togekiss to go down, you miss a Max Glide, and suddenly you're going to be in a real helter-skelter and not have much hope of winning the game. So it's going to really rely on how consistent you can thin your deck early, not only with Max Glide, but also like making sure that you don't have too much fluff left in the deck for when you are getting hit with inevitable stamps and Marnies throughout the game, because that's your biggest fear, really, is this deck. Orbeetle VMAX, I'm kind of enamored with. I really love the ability. I think everyone's in agreement that Eerie Beam is just awesome, and there's certainly something to work around here. From what I've seen so far, even though we have seen that top 8 recently from Orbeetle VMAX, I'm still a little bit nervous. I think the deck ultimately, Gmax Wave is just okay damage output for the most part. You're looking around that 150-200 base mark, I would say, which isn't a bad option at all. But you're looking around that two-shot range a lot of the time. You're really concerned about Crushing Hammer, which really was hugely popular in the previous format, and I can see it being popular again, especially if Orbeetle is going to be a popular archetype, because it has this small cult following after the early results that we've seen. Fire types also seem very solid for me, because fire types not only are going to help deal with Orbeetle, it's going to be great against LucMetal Zacian. Even with the coating metal energy, it only takes fire decks to add in Giratina, and it only takes LucMetal to whiff as well, let's say, for that matchup to be really solid for the fire decks. And we've seen Center Scorch List play Giratina in the past because it helped out against the Eternatus matchup just in general, so I can easily foresee them playing it again. So that weakness is still a big issue. Orbeetle at the moment is playing Weak Guard and Guzhala package, but like I said, fire decks can, gust around the other Orbeetles, because you normally need to spam your board of Orbeetle as much as possible to get as many Eerie Beams off with Bird Keepers, Switches, and U-turn boards, or they can go for Giratina combos and it's still going to be rough. That said, there are some matchups that I think will be a little bit easier for you. I think you're pretty good against PikaRom. I think you're pretty good against Eternatus as well, from what I've seen in the few games that I've had so far. I've been playing this deck for the last like 4 or 5 hours today because I'm really interested in it. And if I could play the deck, I'd really like to because I think it's a lot of fun. And it takes a real slower game plan for sure. My biggest concerns are ADP, just because of the amount of gusting that they have and the fact that you're trying to usually disrupt them and they can just sit there intrepid sorting without too much pressure because the resistance that Zacian has and all these other things is going to make life pretty rough for you. I also think that that just Zamazenta's in the LucMetal deck is going to be a huge issue because you are only trying to do eerie beam pings, and at the same time they can be playing goggles. And yes, you can play Scrapper, but how many do you want to play? Because they're definitely going to be playing 4 goggles, I would say. So yeah, those are my biggest issues with Orbeetle. It's what makes me think it's going to be more a rogue tier archetype. But they've showed us the way for a really good build where you're just playing Snorlax and Orbeetle and Dolls and trying to build around a tag call package with a much slower approach. The tag call supporters easily like munch through your hand quite a lot, so you naturally then are able to Gormandize a lot with Snorlax, which is a really nice combo that we've seen come together really early on in the format, which is a very clever deck building for sure. And it might be something that we could transfer over to other archetypes as well, which will be interesting to see how that pans out. But yeah, there's obvious strengths to Orbeetle as well. I'm just mainly concerned by this fire weakness because it's so obvious that fire is going to have a foothold in this meta because of the power of LucMetal already and ADP to a certain extent. So there's going to be a strange triangle going on where there might be a small rise in water decks because of how strong fire decks are, because of how strong LucMetal is and ADP is. And ADP and LucMetal are strong enough that they should just stay in the format no matter what is going on with type coverage. But Orbeetle kind of just gets hit in that crossfire if LucMetal like sort of remains popular, even though there are good fire decks in the format to try and meet it. Charizard and Leon is a solid one prize deck, like I said. Its damage output can get really huge. Battle Sense is a fantastic ability for just thinning your deck, which is nice in the first place. Obviously, it's going to be one of the great ways that you can combine with a Rangaroo to get Leons into your discard pile to increase your damage output with Royal Blaze even further. But also, it's going to help you cherry pick towards more rare candies and more Charizards and make sure that you have your next attacker ready to rumble. And it means that hopefully you should be relatively stamp proof as you come to the late game. I am concerned that it's a slow stage 2 and you can obviously fall behind quite quickly with this deck, especially against ADP, I would say. Even with the weakness that you can boast against them, I'm still concerned that they're probably going to be able to GX attack and then use Ultimate Ray before you're able to take the knockout on the ADP, unless you've drawn very, very well. But it's quite easy, especially if you like prize a Leon or something like that. It's going to become rough for you. So yeah, the issues are kind of apparent. You know it's a stage 2 deck. You have to make some compromises here and there. And those are the big hurdles for Charizard Leon, I'd say. Donphan Spiritomb. I really like the typing, again, similar to what I was saying with the Colossal VMAX. Earthquake doing that solid 120 means that you can easily be using Boss and Great Catcher on Dedenne, Crobat, and taking nice 2-prize knockouts, whilst at the same time setting up Spiritombs for later as you build Spite and use good old Toughness Capes as well to make those Spiritombs have a very, very solid damage cap as well in the high 200s at times. You can even make combos with Martial Arts Dojo and basic fightings in the deck to push into the 300s at the highest end. So that's pretty cool. I think this is a solid one-prize archetype. I think it's just slightly weaker to ADP than the likes of Whimsicott, which is why I can't put it any higher on the list. But again, this could be another sort of nail in the coffin for PikaRom. We've said it so many times that PikaRom is going to be worse in the upcoming format, and it still found a way to be successful. And that kind of makes me think that fighting will still be relevant because I think there still will be lightning decks in the format. People just can't put down PikaRom, basically. They'll never give up until it's actually rotated. And in general, you're a nice one-prize deck. You have decent damage output in most matchups where the 120 from Donphan leads into Spiritomb's output quite nicely, as long as you can find your Cape of Toughness. So I think that's pretty solid overall. I think the biggest issues are, obviously, if you're missing Fampies in the early turns and you only really have, you know, the likes of Great Ball and Quick Ball to get them rolling in the first place, and then getting into the active and actually using Donphan on turn 2. It doesn't sound like much, but the game's so fast right now that anytime you miss a beat, you basically insta-lose the game. So there's a small concern there that we're still quite heavily setup based. We're not purely just using basic Pokemon the whole time. We're trying to lean into the Donphan as quickly as possible because that's really what gets the whole game going for you, because it speeds up your Spiritomb so much. And without that, you're really not doing anything. And then there's always the concern that there are times where you have to play around Tool Scrapper and times where you simply can't play around Tool Scrapper. And if your opponent has it at the right time, they can take multiple prize knockouts. And not only that, they're removing multiple threats from your board all at once. And that's going to be a huge issue for you. If you're trying to set up your win condition based on a late game Spiritomb doing a huge chunk, your opponent can simply scrapper off the Cape of Toughness and take multiple prize turns, and it's going to get really, really ugly for you. So that's a small issue of Donphan Spiritomb. Cramorant is a fun one that we've already posted on the channel. It is one prize based. You do have decent damage output. We've got Missile, a 60 times multiplier is very, very solid. The main issue is really, though, that you don't have a conventional draw supporter at your side because you're having to use Nessa so much to recycle Arrokudas. And the fact that your board space is filled with these Arrokudas means that you can't really commit spaces to conventional draw Pokemon like Dedennes, Eldegoss, Oricorio even, Oranguru, those sorts of cards that you'd love to put in most decks to make sure that you're consistent. We can't really get away with that too much. You can normally put like one or two of them down maximum, but it gets a little bit ugly from there. So more of a fun one, I would say. Darmanitan Spread certainly has impressed people, but that's because it's an impressive deck, really, I would say. It can do some of the most powerful things in the game. Max Wipeout doing 200 to the active and 30 spread to all of your opponent's bench. When you telescopic sight this guy, doing 60 bench spreads on really important bench sitters that many, many decks are playing, it is really, really huge. And the Alolan Sandslash GX attack options, Spiky Storm GX, doing 100 to everything that's already got damage counters on them, is a huge way that you can take, 6 prize turns, sometimes even more than 6 prize turns, all in one go. So when you see the deck working, you think it's absolutely insane, to be honest. You look at it and everything's gone right in those early turns, and it feels super intimidating. But it just won't work all that often because you require so much. You need to find 2 stage 1s plus 4 basic energy cards on turn 2. You even need to get active with Galarian Darmanitan, and you need to hope your opponents put down enough bench Pokemon for you to set up towards Aegislash if you want to play Aegislash. Now, Aegislash may be the dreamer combo, and it may be better off just being Darmanitan Frosmoth and saying that the 60 damage spread from Telescopic Sight is good enough for you. But possibly the Sandslash is going to be the only thing that makes you fast enough to actually beat the likes of ADP. The reason why I mentioned ADP specifically is because Galarian Darmanitan is weak to Metal, which means it's got paper-thin defenses against LucMetal and ADP-Zacian, and I think that spells trouble. That means you're really doing a lot of work, jumping through a ton of hoops for a Zacian to simply sword through you and take an easy 3 prize knockout. And even the Sandslash is weak to Metal. Not that it matters too much, but it means that even like Aegislash or something could get a knockout on it as well, or more wild for just 2 attachments, which actually is a big deal when they're digging for sources and stuff. So yeah, I think it's a lot of setup. It's going to have highlight reel moments, no doubt, and it's going to feel amazing when it does work. When you've been given enough turns to actually use this guy, he's going to be a huge threat. But I think for the format that I'm expecting, I would say it's very risky of a play. You're hoping to find the Fire decks and hoping that the Fire decks keep the ADP and the Luke at bay, because otherwise you're really going to be struggling. And even then, what we've seen from Inteleon very often missed its turn to attack from all of the testing that I had, and this is 1 additional energy card, which doesn't sound like much because normally you're digging for buckets anyway, so it's going to have a similar percentage as Inteleon, but Inteleon didn't really have like a less awkward weakness because it was weak to lightning in its own regard, but it set up its game plan a little bit more obviously than Max Wipeout, which is just trying to like get the whole board, and if you're using Telescopic Sight on top of that, you're getting more targets all at once, whereas Inteleon could piece apart your opponent's board more specifically, and I think that's still going to be better than Darmanitan, I guess. Pikachu VMAX does have a few things going for it. I imagine you're going to build this more like a PikaRom that then weaves in like a 2-2 Pikachu VMAX just to have a late game sweeper, because PikaRom, since losing E-Power, really has missed that late game damage output threat. Really, it's just trying to use Stamps and Raichu to buy itself a free turn with Paralysis, or trying to use that big GX attack to hit 250. Now we have another option in the deck that can get you to 270 if you do that G-Max Volt Tackle with the discard. Additionally, you can put something in the active that can tank a lot more hits in the game, especially against things like Eternatus, which, again, like I was saying with the Raichu, you're kind of just stamp praying that they don't have switch outs, and the Pikachu can sit there and actually force more than that, which is very reasonable. And I think pretty good. So the Pikachu probably is going to be going in the PikaRom deck and becomes more like a late game bomb. There's also the option of using Electrode for Buzzap Generator to lean more into the hand disruption options with reset stamps and such, while you're giving away individual prize Pokemon and then having 3 prizes with the PikaRom in the early turns that are probably going to be sacrificed to full blitzing towards the Pikachu VMAX. And then, again, you can be doing Marnies and Stamps and putting your opponents down to low hand sizes, whilst also promoting this big Pikachu, which can hopefully finish things off that you've full blitzed early on, and then move into that G-Max Volt Tackle as well as you go. That's the hope there. I think the only real issues with the Pikachu VMAX is it doesn't add anything in terms of consistency. It doesn't add too many new things. Like, it gives you one turn of, like, a bigger bomb than you currently have with Raichu, which is, like, a one-card include that's good anyway. Whereas Pikachu VMAX is way more specific in what it can do, and is going to eat up more slots in your deck and be slower. And at the same time, I think it doesn't change anything. Like, the Pikachu's still weak to fighting, and you can still only, in air quotes, hit 270, which is, not that much different from the 250 that the Raichu's doing. So I think it fulfills a slightly good niche, but I think not good enough to actually warrant the spaces from a typical PikaRom, especially because, like I said earlier, PikaRom is going to have a lot of hurdles in this new format, and I don't think Pikachu VMAX is necessarily that answer to all those issues. Raichu with Electrode. This is basically cutting out the middleman of Full Blitz and just going straight into Tandem Shocks and Lightning Rides a lot more quickly, trying to lean into that Green's Exploration engine and trying to stamp people as quickly as possible, basically. Like I said, similar to those engines where you're using Mismagius or Magneton, you can do something along those lines with this archetype here, and trying to weave in paralysis as well. Now, there's a lot of switching still in the format. That's not changing too much. And I think that's a bit of a concern, but whenever you're doing it alongside stamping, you're going to be reasonable. I really like the resistance to metal that Raichu has. It's still one of the best things about this card, to be honest. Keeps you out of range, even from buffed Zacians. And you can also, pivot into Dolls and have some prize denial going on for you. So, yeah, I really do like those options. The biggest issues for ChuChu going forward is that it's a lot less tanky in the new format because Colossal is becoming a thing, and that's something to be hugely afraid of, especially because they're normally playing a ton of Malolana, so they're going to have easy outs to paralysis whilst instantly just one-shotting you. And your damage cap is becoming a little low as more VMAXs come into the format. So I do think that's a small issue. You could be denied ever using a Lightning Ride GX attack for full value if you're up against any hammer-based decks, and that's another small issue as well. So I think this could be reasonable, and I think we've seen so many Greens decks be successful in the past just because early stamp to like 4 is so detrimental to certain players, and Raichu is good at capitalizing on that quite easily. But I do think there's the glaring Lightning issue going forward if Colossal ends up being successful. Clefable Dolls, again, more of a kind of rogue tier archetype where you're trying to spam the new the Clefairy's attack from Cosmic Eclipse. The new include from Vivid Voltage is the Memory Capsule, which allows you to evolve into Clefable and fulfill Clefairy's attack cost with triple acceleration energy and try and use this prankish ability over and over and over again. It simply has really good matchups and really poor matchups. Basically, if you're not against... if you're against any deck that can use one energy attacking options, you're going to have a really, really bad time. And if you're up against decks that have multiple energy attachments and aren't welder-based, you're going to have a really, really good time because Prankish is going to be troll against them for sure. There's a ton of new one-prize decks in the format which probably are only playing like a couple copies of Boss, which gives you a lot of time to use Pokedolls and other walls available to you, which could give you a good time, but I think not enough to really go away from the core of the new format. And Clefable, just its damage output is so low that LucMetal probably just instantly walls and beats you, and ADP probably just gusts around you enough times, so definitely on the rogue scale of things, but worth mentioning for sure because it's a cool combo. And finally, we have the Amazing Rare box. I've seen a few different renditions of this, and I've not been hugely impressed with any of them, to be honest. So you can take any of these with a pinch of salt. I've tried Trumbeak, I've tried Porygon Z with like a bunch of Aurora energies and all the specific special energies as well. I've tried Energy Switch Turbo Patch. I've tried Metal Saucer Energy Switch as well. You can Metal Saucer onto Amazing Rare Jirachi and E-switch them onto your other targets whilst attaching. I think B has been probably the most promising one because I think Zamazenta is one of the strongest attackers that you can be playing. I think leaning into that fighting type coverage is important, and Zamazenta also has an one energy attack that can attach to itself as well. So I think probably B is going to be the strongest way to play this, and when you say that out loud, it makes you really skeptical that the deck's going to be good, because if you're just leaning into the fighting weakness that Zamazenta's boasting, you could be playing much better fighting decks in general. But they're going to be less cool than Amazing Rare Box, no doubt. But I do think this is going to be quite clunky and difficult to get working. So yeah, it's rough. Even if you are using B, that's going to give you the best chance to chain attackers with Zamazenta over any other option that I've seen so far. But whenever you're using B, you're not using a draw supporter, so you're going to have to commit to using draw-based Pokemon a lot of the time, and that means you're still going to be putting down multiple prize Pokemon with the Dene and stuff like that, and yeah, you could just be way more consistent decks. I think that's really going to be it. I think people will be memeing with this on the ladder, but it's never going to be all that strong. With that said, we're going to look at the impacts that Vivid Voltage is having on the decks that we know are very strong in the format. And I've flipped them into 4 categories, as I usually do. Those that are thriving, those that are declining, those that are adapting, and those that are non-movers. Basically, they gain, very little. They don't change much inherently in their own 60-card lists. Now, that doesn't mean they don't change in the meta, and I'm sure some of them that I've put as non-movers could be improving just as the meta evolves, but that's extremely skeptical, and it's impossible for me to tell you, what percentages decks are going to start seeing play. I can tell you what I think is going to be improving, just in terms of their own inherent 60s, but not necessarily how the format's going to be completely panning out. That said, let's look at the distribution that I've put for the decks here. I think really ADP-Zacian seems to be completely fine. It doesn't really lose anything and gains a couple extra options here and there. LucMetal definitely is going to be improving, and I think Inteleon Frosmoth is going to sit in this weird situation where I think it's a little bit worried about the LucMetal matchup, but I think it's going to be one of the decks capitalizing most on the amount of fire decks in the format. I think with ADP and LucMetal looking to be the top tier decks of the format, I think Inteleon gaining a few percentage points against ADP thanks to Telescopic Sight, meaning that you can win the game one turn earlier a lot of the time, because ADP basically always has to put down Crobats into Denes to get its combos rolling. And the fact that there's going to be Baby Blacephalon and probably an increased amount of Center Scorch in the format means that Inteleon probably is going to sit nicely in tier 2, keeping these fire decks in check, as what I believe to be the strongest Frosmoth variant going forward, thanks to Telescopic Sight. Now, there is Werelord as well, Werelord Frosmoth, and if Lightning decks completely fall off a cliff, possibly Werelord is the strongest, because Werelord Frosmoth actually has a very positive LucMetal Zacian. I can tell you that for certain, because I've actually played a lot of Frosmoth Werelord, which is quite fun. But yeah, I think for adapting decks, like I said, I wanted to talk about Rillaboom VMAX because it gains some very specific pieces from this format, which I think are relevant. Eternatus decks, I don't think they're going to fall off a cliff, but I do think they are slightly concerned by Colossal, slightly concerned by LucMetal potentially creeping up as well. I think your matchup against Inteleon got a lot worse also because of Telescopic Sight being included. So I think you're losing percentage points against a lot of matchups that are adapting from Vivid Voltage. And I think Mewtwo, PikaRom, Mewtwo, the sort of Aurora counter box where you're playing, like sometimes Milotic, sometimes Galarian Surfetch'd, as well as all this other stuff. I think that's probably going to be the strongest Mewtwo deck going forward. Possibly Welder Mewtwo, but I think Welder Mewtwo is too reliant on the Mewtwo itself, and things like Whimsicott are going to capitalize on that. Whereas Mewtwo can go more counter-based and be type-covering-based. So I think they're just going to sort of change the toolkit based on how the format reacts and still be pretty okay. So that's why I've put that in adapting. For declining decks, I think PikaRom is obviously in fear of the new fighting decks coming out, and is somewhat concerned by Whimsicott as well, I would say. Mewtwo decks, very concerned about Whimsicott if that's actually going to be an archetype, but I believe Whimsicott is good enough to sit around tier 2 and simply bully the likes of PikaRom and Mewtwo if they are sticking around in the format. I also think Whimsicott's pretty solid against Eternatus from my testing so far. I think it's reasonable against the likes of Inteleon. I think it's reasonable against ADP, like I said, with the help of either Heracross or Latios. So yeah, I think that's going to be a solid deck. And I do think Deci Goons should see a decline. And now, whenever you think a deck like this should see a decline, means it may actually be a better play, because it depends really if ADP actually respects Deci Goons enough to actually put the Aegislash into their deck. And if we start seeing Deci Goons kind of fall off that cliff, people start cutting the cutting the Aegislash, and then Deci Goons is a good play again. So, bit of mind games for Deci Goons, but in theory, I would say with more one-prize decks like Whimsicott coming out, a bigger reason to play Blacephalon as the format develops, there should be fewer and fewer reasons to play Deci Goons, in my personal opinion. And then for non-movers, this really is cards like decks that don't really gain new cards, but could be slightly improving in the format. I think Escadrille Control doesn't really change much. You sort of have to wait and see with the format to see what that deck needs to do with. Attacking Escadrille has a few new competitors for better fighting decks potentially, but it may end up being stronger than Donphan Spiritomb anyways, so still could be filling that one prize fighting niche. Center Scorch, I think, is going to be solid, as with Blacephalon. I think it gets better placed in the format, because there's going to be a bigger emphasis on LucMetal and ADP, I believe, than there currently has been. So I think those decks are going to be fine. I think Mad Party is getting bullied out a little bit by other one-prize decks. I think if you currently enjoy playing Mad Party, you'll probably have more victories with Whimsicott, is my opinion. Dragapult VMAX will enjoy seeing Eternatus fall off a little bit, but it's still very concerned about LucMetal Zacian. So if LucMetal sort of replaces the amount of Eternatus that we saw anyway, Dragapult's not too happy about that. So that's a bit of an issue. And I think Welderbox is still fine. There's Aurora-based builds of Welderbox, which are probably still going to be okay as well. You can be adaptive. Or we can just see lists that are splitting the Heatrans, the Charizard, and weaving in some Blounds as well. I think those are all solid decks, to be honest, and they don't really gain anything from the set, so I just left them in non-movers, but I feel Welder decks are still completely fine in this format. So, for those that are changing then, let's look at ADP. It gains Aegislash, potentially the VMAX as well if you want to. Now, the VMAX lets you get through tag teams without having to need a boss on the second attempt, so that means if you Ultimate Ray with a boss turn on like a Dedenne or a Crobat and power up an Aegislash-V and then turn it into a VMAX, you can get through an opposing ADP, basically. And that's a good deal, but I think in general, most ADPs will just play Aegislash-V. You can potentially play Coating Metal if you are concerned about those fire matchups, but I believe you're probably better served just playing pure basic energy lists, as we've seen more recently, just because of Energy Switch synergy and Metal Saucer synergy. And there's also the option of Leon. I don't think Leon's a great option either, but it, again, can be a way that you can Brave Blade through an ADP, so that's potentially okay. Ultimately, though, I think it's like you just add in Aegislash and it's completely fine. You're much happier getting through walls. If you do add in Leon as well, it could certainly help out against the LucMetal matchup as well. I should mention that because you can Brave Blade through even a goggled Zacian after their GX attack, so you can do an additional 60 damage to their reduction of 60 to finally Brave Blade through them. So if LucMetal is popular enough, Leon may be worth it because it's that midway point between like being a boss's orders in the mirror and being a way of dealing with a Zacian against LucMetal. So it could sit in that really nice middle ground where it could be worth the one space if you're playing Eldegoss. I think you're happy seeing any new one-prize deck coming out in the format, and I think if anyone is trying to style it out with Darmanitan, you're pretty okay with that. I think there's nothing too worrying from the new set, to be honest, to be afraid of. And yeah, I think at the moment there's not too much different with the deck, but you gain a new Wall Breaker, which is like pretty good, I would say. LucMetal Zacian gains probably the most, I would say. Aegislash as well can be a wall-breaking card for you. I know LucMetal can previously play things like Stunfisk to try and make the Deci Goons matchup pretty good for you. Aegislash can be a more proactive answer, which is pretty okay. the Aegislash VMAX is probably much more reasonable in this archetype than it would be in ADP, because you have a much better late game damage output and become a real threat. So it's going to be interesting to see if LucMetal actually does pull the trigger on Aegislash or not. We've seen that they've somehow made space for Bronzongs in the past, so perhaps the Aegislash can finally see play here. Coating Metal is an obvious include to give yourself a better option than previously used Weak Guard energy, because obviously these can now be attached to Zacians more easily. And there's also the Surchester buff, which can increase the reduction that you're making your opponent get through to just become even more tanky if you want to. Now, LucMetal still could be playing Swell, but Surchester is a different stadium option if need be. I think you are pretty happy with most of the new decks coming out. This is why I think LucMetal is just getting better, because I think it's naturally like pretty well placed in the format as is right now. And the two new decks that I think are touted to be the strongest don't really have any good answers to it. I think LucMetal has natural psychic resist and can be using its Jets attack and all this other stuff, and Malolanas against Whimsicott, which is a huge issue. They just have naturally so much healing and sometimes dolls and stuff on top of that, and they can slow roll their way through Whimsicott, I think. And Colossal does not have many good answers to Zamazenta at all, so an army of those is going to be really easy for you to take the dub there. And Darmanitan has weakness to metal, so yeah, I think the two big ones, obviously, Colossal and Whimsicott, are pretty good for you. I think Charizard Leon, if that's going to be an archetype, could be feasting on you, but that's the only real new threat, I would say. So yeah, I think in general, LucMetal's sitting kind of well. That said, it kind of brings about more fire matchups, I'm sure. And like I said, some of the fire decks have played Distortion Door, or sorry, what's the ability? Dimension Breach Giratina in the past, and they could certainly do that again. And then you're back at square one with LucMetal Zacian in the fire matchups, but that's always been an issue for it, and it's not stopped it being this successful pre-Vivid Voltage anyway. So I could still foresee it seeing a good amount of play. Inteleon Frosmoth also gains a lot here. Leon could be a nice way for you to now try and work towards two shots on Eternatus, which was previously a bit of an issue. Nessa could be a nice way to reload your next Inteleon VMAX. Essentially, you just recover everything that got knocked out and put down your Inteleon again and attach all those energies that just got binned. Alternatively, if you're worried about things like Decidueye and Obstagoon, you can add in tech cards as like one-ofs now, and Nessa being in your deck means you can recycle them in the matchup that you're concerned against. So previously you just kind of conceded or played like one random Suicune and hoped that that was good enough. Now Nessa makes that option a lot better for you. Telescopic Sight, probably the biggest one. It's not a consistency card, but man, it improves max bullets so much that it is so worth it trying to add in like 2 to 3 copies of that in your deck. It gives this deck a huge amount of reach and makes it a huge threat. It is kind of high roll, trying to get both stage 2s online, turn 2, and getting 3 energy and the Telescopic Sight. It's a lot to ask for, but you become a very powerful board state when you do get that off. It is very intimidating to stare down the Inteleon when they do get it all rolling. Barraibewda, potentially 1 energy attacking option. I don't think you'll take that option, but it was something I wanted to mention. And Amazing Red Jirachi, it's less draw than a regular Jirachi, but it also takes up way less space. And I think if you're playing Telescopic Sight, you probably won't be playing Zigzagoon Scoop Up Net anymore either. So I think you're gaining spaces by changing your Jirachi to the new Amazing Rare, and then adding in Telescopic Sight, and removing the Scoop Up Net Zigzagoon and Stellar Wish Jirachi stuff, and just going down that direction and gaining a few spaces along the way as well. That's how I foresee Inteleon going in the future. I think you really enjoy seeing any one prize deck coming out. In general, I think Mew obviously is a card that most of the one prize decks will be playing anyway, but it's not a hard stretch for you to gust them at any point, take that knockout, and oftentimes these one prize decks are already playing to Denes and stuff, so you can just jump over them on certain prize trade turns and be pretty okay. I think the threats coming out are potentially new lightning decks, but in general, you're really, really hoping that the fighting decks, Stormfan and Colossal, are keeping these at bay. And hopefully, just in a vacuum, this deck gets stronger, so you should be pretty reasonable. I think the biggest fear is that Inteleon gets to a point where it sees enough play, or it sees enough play alongside enough other spread-based decks that it then leads to people actually putting Mew into their 60s. I think right now, going into the format, I don't think many decks will be playing Mew at all. Only really like one prize deck should be playing Mew. as they kind of always have done. But I think like ADP probably shouldn't, LucMetal definitely shouldn't, Eternatus can't. Fire decks are going to lose to Inteleon thanks to weakness anyway, so you wouldn't play Mew in any of those situations. So I think like a ton of decks won't be playing Mew regardless, and hopefully you should get away with Telescopic Sight. But if it becomes a big enough deck, maybe some people are playing that Mew, and that becomes an issue for you. Onto the things that are then adapting. I think you don't gain too many cards. I think Leon is a cool addition. If you are playing the straight Eternatus list, this can be a lot less clunky than going down the poison route. And now you have the upside, if you're playing Pokegears, to then have Leon on top of all your Zigzagoon scoop up net pings to get a big dread end turn. That's basically the whole reason why the poison build exists. The poison build has a better time against LucMetal, but in general, it's also trying to help reach on opposing VMAXs thanks to the poison ticks that can help get you in range of a dread end. Leon can do a very similar thing. Now, yes, it is spending your supporter, but you're playing 4 Crobats. That's the whole point of the deck, so that you can have the flexibility to use these sorts of supporters and still get your next VMAX, your next attachment, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think Leon could be, although it's like the only thing Eternatus gains, it could be a big deal for it and could be one of the saving graces for this archetype for staying relevant. That said, though, there's a ton of new decks you need to be worried about. Colossal's a problem. Whimsicott isn't the easiest matchup. Darmanitan naturally spreads on your board and you can't not put down Pokemon. You need to do damage. Donphan's a problem. Amazing Red Box even is a problem with their weakness. Now, obviously, I think Clefable Dolls and Amazing Red Box are probably meme decks anyway, but take note of those other threats out there. I think they will be issues, and I do think that's a bit of a problem. That said, you know, you can just weave in Piers and Weak Guard if you really want to. If you're that concerned about the fighting matchups, that's something that I think a lot of Eternatus players may look towards. You don't even need to play Piers, to be honest. You can just try and play like 3 Weak Guard and hope you hit them. It's a bit annoying that you can't play Captures anymore. Captures did have a small upside. But regardless, Weak Guard can be weaved into the list, and I think Eternatus will still be okay. I think this survives a lot better than PikaRom does, just because it has the splash ability and the option to play Weak Guard. On to Rillaboom. I didn't miss one there, did I? No. Rillaboom VMAX. I wanted to talk about this as an adapting deck because it gains Zarude V, and I think that's a really, really big deal. I think previously, I didn't even know why anyone was playing Rillaboom VMAX. I'll be straight up honest with you guys. I thought this deck was like completely useless. It was clunky, slow, and didn't even have a win condition. Now it's clunky, it's slow, but it does have a win condition. Zarude V gives you that option. You can now be hitting with max beating, setting up a 2-shot on VMAXs. You get hit in the face with your by your opponent. You've got 330 hit points. You should be tanking in most situations that aren't fire matchups. And then you can go into Zarude V, load it up with Voltage Beat, and then use Zarude V to heal off your Rillaboom VMAX, whilst also setting it up for the next turn. So this is something the deck hasn't had. Previously, you would go all in your Rillaboom, it would die, and then because the energy attack cost is 4, you can't set up your next Rillaboom, you can't win the game. You have to look towards other attackers, and there really weren't any other options for Grass. So now with Zarude, you finally have that midway point, something that can finish things off after a max beating whilst also healing your main attacker. Now, like I said, you're still a stage 1 and a stage 2. Yes, Turfield definitely does help. You're still slow and clunky, but you actually have a real life win condition now. So that's really, really cool for the deck. Good job, Rillaboom. And if Colossal becomes popular enough, you have something that you can feast on as well. That said, you're worried about fire decks, obviously, and you're kind of still low-key worried about LucMetal, so there's still plenty of issues for Rillaboom, but I just wanted to give it the nod that it finally has a win condition, and I won't laugh now that I look at the archetype, because there's actually a reason to play it now, finally. It also does gain Amazing Regirachi, which I think is a small improvement, just something to mention as well. Onto the decks that I think are declining. I've already sort of touched on most of these. There are some new additions for PikaRom, potentially, like I said, but I all think they're kind of mediocre, and none of them help solve the issues that are going forward. And that's that fighting types are coming. Whimsicott's a new one-prize deck that you really don't want to look into. And Eternatus is on the decline as well. This is another thing that's actually a problem for PikaRom. PikaRom actually enjoyed the Eternatus matchup as long as you flipped heads on hammers. And I think that's another matchup that you don't appreciate going down in play. I think there are much harder matchups for PikaRom out there going forward. I think realistically, I would look towards playing a Mewtwo-based variant of Pikachu going forward, because you can go the yellow route when you're not against the fighting stuff, and when you are against the fighting stuff, you can lean more into the Mewtwo. So I think we're going to see a mash of those two archetypes because both PikaRom and Mewtwo on their own are very, very concerned about big type coverage in the format, which is Whimsicott and Colossal. Now, if you can combine them together, you can use the right ones in the right matchups, if that makes sense. Other Mewtwo variants that aren't the lightning-based build as well, I guess, to a certain extent. I think all of the Mewtwo variants are slowly getting power crept by the other things. I think if you're a Frosmoth deck, I definitely look towards Inteleon now that it gains Telescopic Sight. I think it's a really big deal for the deck. If you're welder-based, I think you should lean into that typing as much as possible. Now, yes, Mewtwo does play basic fire Pokemon that you can put into play. Like, you'll play a Reshizard, you'll play a Victini V most of the time. But I think you should be playing Heatran, to be honest. I think Heatran is super good against, especially ADP. So I would lean in towards other fire decks more often than Welder Mewtwo these days. And I just think it doesn't really gain much, and you get bodied by Whimsicott, so I just don't see why you'd be taking the risk as Mewtwo going forward. Like I said, I think only really the lightning-based build is still worth building around, because I think the lightning-based build has enough acceleration and enough Aurora-based type coverage that you can remain relevant, but I think the other ones are starting to fall off a little bit. And Deci Goons is kind of concerned about the amount of one-prize decks coming out. Whimsicott, Charizard, Clefable Dolls as well is actually a low-key auto loss for you because you have too expensive of an energy attack cost most of the time. You do gain Telescopic Sight to increase your spread, but it doesn't really change your win condition because normally you just want to set up one of these stage 2s and just like keep announcing the attack over and over again because your opponent can't answer you. So Telescopic Sight doesn't actually change that too much. Aromatic Grass Energy is kind of okay for helping you not get paralyzed against ChuChu, but really that's not like the biggest deal anyway. So yeah, I think there's some nice includes, but not enough to make me think the deck's going to be that much better in a vacuum, and there are more hurdles for you to get over. That said, whenever anyone writes off Deci Goons, that's where it's at its most dangerous because people don't tech for it, and that's when it actually starts winning. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Deci Goons. So onto the general shifts of the meta. Really, it's not hugely impactful. I think most decks are going to stay pretty much the same, at least how they've been built in the first place. I think we're not going to see a huge shift. Like sometimes we'll see an additional Leon in certain archetypes. Eternatus is going to be changing. We're going to see a lot less PikaRom, I would imagine, and potentially just a couple new archetypes around. There are a ton of one-prize decks which can see some experimentation. Now that said, ADP is extremely oppressive against most one-prize decks, so I wouldn't expect that to do too much. And really the last point is just that weakness is becoming more of a factor. There's going to be this weird Triforce going on where there's going to be fire decks trying to deal with the grass and lightning and metal decks, I should say. And then there's Inteleon in there trying to capitalize on those. Inteleon's worried about the lightning decks in the format if they can remain relevant, and it's really hoping that Colossal, the new guy, comes in to deal with the PikaRom and the Eternatus. So there's some weird triangles going on with type coverage, and that's something to look for going forward. I think Weak Guard Energy is going to see a lot more play because of exactly that reason, and it could get to the point where Giratina is a tech card in a ton of decks for Weak Guard, and the fact that it's good in a ton of other matchups anyway. Like, it's always been historically pretty good against Eternatus. There's even more special energy coming out in this set as well. Orbeetle already has been playing like just basic, but just special energy, I should say. So plenty of reasons to think about the Giratina as well as a tech card going forward. I did a lot of talking. My voice is absolutely dead, but I hope you did enjoy this video, guys, and I'll be seeing you tomorrow for another video, so cheers.